In the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the gleaming marble colonnades that shimmered under the Mediterranean sun, a darker truth festered in the shadows. Historians regale us with tales of gladiators, emperors, and legions marching to conquer the known world, but there's a story they rarely tell, one that whispers of the women who dared to defy, and the chilling punishments crafted to silence them. These were not mere penalties, they were spectacles of cruelty, designed to strip women of their humanity and etch fear into the hearts of an empire. Among the most haunting were the sexual punishments inflicted on wives who strayed from their husband's command. In Rome, marriage wasn't love, it was property. A wife's body was bound to her husband's honor, and disobedience could twist her fate into a nightmare of shame. Picture this: noble women dragged into the forum, their hair shorn as crowds jeered, their garments torn to expose their shame. Others were condemned to brothels by the very men who vowed to protect them, forced into a life of servitude not for crimes, but for defiance. Roman law didn't stop at humiliation. It permitted husbands to kill a lover in cold blood, exile a wife to desolate islands, or subject her to punishments that blurred the line between justice and desecration. This was a society where public degradation wasn't a scandal, it was a duty. Intimacy itself became a weapon, and Rome's obsession with control turned women into symbols of fear, silence, and shame. Before we descend into these shadows, pause for a moment. If history's hidden truths ignite your curiosity, if you believe the past holds lessons beyond marble statues and military triumphs, join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share this story with others who crave the untold. Leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and let's build a community bound by curiosity, compassion, and the courage to face the stories history tried to bury. Together, we'll uncover the silence of the past to understand the true price of power and the human cost Rome never meant to be remembered. Let's begin. To understand why Rome devised such twisted punishments for disobedient wives, we must step into the world where these women lived, a world where law, family, and power revolved around one core idea: control. In the early days of the Roman Republic, discipline was the backbone of society. The household was a microcosm of the empire, ruled by the paterfamilias, the father whose authority was absolute. Under the doctrine of patria potestas, a father could disown, sell, or even kill his children or slaves. A husband inherited a fragment of this terrifying power over his wife. Marriage in Rome wasn't a partnership of equals, it was a transfer of ownership. A woman moved from her father's household to her husband's, her autonomy surrendered, her body and honor bound to his will. Girls were married off shockingly young, often at 12 or 13, barely old enough to grasp the vows spoken on their behalf. For them, marriage was a passage from one cage to another. Love, companionship, or personal choice were irrelevant. What mattered was lineage, alliance, and obedience. A wife was expected to be a silent keeper of honor, chaste in body and submissive in spirit. Her role was to bear legitimate heirs, manage the household, and uphold her husband's reputation. Any deviation, whether real or rumored, could unravel her existence. By the time Augustus rose to power in the 1st century BCE, Rome was transforming. The Republic had been torn apart by civil wars, and the new empire sought to redefine itself. Augustus, styling himself as the restorer of Roman virtue, introduced laws to purify society. Among them was the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis of 18 BCE, a law that turned a wife's disobedience, whether through adultery or defiance, into a public crime. No longer a private matter, a wife's actions were now a concern of the state. Husbands could denounce their wives before magistrates, strip them of property, banish them to desolate islands, or subject them to humiliations designed to erase their dignity. Adultery was equated with treason, not just against the family, but against the empire itself. This law wasn't about morality, it was about control. Rome's men feared disorder above all else. Disorder in the streets sparked revolts. Disorder in the household threatened lineage. A wife who defied her role was a crack in the empire's moral facade. Punishments, therefore, weren't just about pain, they were spectacles meant to terrify. They were warnings etched into the public consciousness, reminding every woman of her place. The irony is stark. While Augustus preached virtue, he surrounded himself with concubines. Senators railed against immorality while frequenting brothels. Yet it was the wives, young, silenced, trapped, who bore the weight of Rome's hypocrisy. Roman punishments for disobedient wives were not private affairs, they were public performances, designed to maximize shame and reinforce control. Humiliation was the empire's currency, lingering long after pain faded. One of the most chilling practices was the public shaving of a woman's head. In Roman culture, a woman's hair was more than vanity, it was a symbol of her chastity and respectability. To shear it away was to strip her identity. Ancient sources describe women dragged into the forum, their heads forcibly shaved as crowds spat insults, their shorn locks scattered like ashes of dignity. Clothing, too, was weaponized. A disobedient wife might be forced to appear in tattered garments, her once proud stola, the matron's dress of honor, torn to expose her body. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was symbolism. The torn cloth mirrored the tearing of family honor, her body a canvas of disgrace. Some women were paraded through the streets like captives of war, their names shouted, their alleged crimes inscribed on wooden tablets held aloft by guards. Passers-by jeered, children threw stones, and men hurled lewd insults. For a society obsessed with honor, to be seen in such a state was worse than death. Others faced ritualized confessions in sacred temples, trembling before priests who intoned prayers of purification while onlookers whispered. Imagine the terror. Betrayed by your husband, branded before gods and mortals as a symbol of corruption. Some were stripped of jewelry, dowries, and even their names, their disgrace announced publicly so that shame followed them like a shadow. These rituals weren't accidental, they were deliberate. Rome could have punished discreetly, but it chose spectacle because shame was contagious. A noble woman reduced to a public example warned every wife in the empire. Obedience was survival, disobedience was ruin. The hypocrisy was grotesque. Roman men, senators, soldiers, emperors, indulged in excess, keeping concubines and frequenting brothels openly. Yet wives had no such freedom. Their bodies were bound by law, their reputations held hostage by honor. The satirist Juvenal sneered at women's supposed immorality, but his words reveal a deeper truth. Men orchestrated this theater of degradation. Wives were punished not for what they did, but for what men feared they might become. Autonomous, defiant, ungovernable. As Rome's empire grew more decadent, punishments escalated from symbolic shame to physical and sexualized cruelty. These were spectacles so disturbing that even Roman historians, accustomed to blood and brutality, wrote of them with unease. One of the most grotesque practices was the forced brothel sentence. A husband who chose not to kill or exile his wife could condemn her to a state-run brothel. To Romans, this was a fitting fate for a woman who had misused her chastity. Imagine a patrician lady, once seated in marble atriums, now chained to a filthy wooden bed, the stench of sweat and wine suffocating her, forced to serve strangers until her body and spirit broke. Ancient satirists wrote of such cases with cruel amusement, but their laughter reeks of hypocrisy. For the woman, it was a living execution, not death by blade, but death by degradation stretched across years. Other punishments were equally cruel. Some women were forced to perform humiliating sexual acts before magistrates or in ritualized confessions. Others were paraded naked, their punishment sexualized for the pleasure of onlookers. Roman society thrived on spectacles, and the humiliation of women became another form of entertainment. In private villas, husbands staged their own punishments, binding wives, forcing them into degrading acts, or surrounding them with concubines to remind them of their worthlessness. These acts were veiled as discipline, but they were expressions of paranoia and control, fueled by Rome's obsession with dominating the body. Under the emperors, these punishments became monstrous. Caligula, the infamous Mad Emperor, was known to parade noble women, including senators' wives, into his feasts. There, he would strip them naked, mock their bodies, and sometimes force them into intimate acts before their humiliated husbands. It wasn't enough to punish a wife. Caligula weaponized shame to break men as well. Nero followed suit. His wife Octavia, beloved for her virtue, fell victim to his paranoia. Falsely accused of adultery, she was dragged through the streets, her hair cut, her body exposed, and exiled to the barren island of Pandateria. Days later, executioners opened her veins, leaving her to bleed out in silence. Rome's most virtuous empress, reduced to nothing for a fabricated crime. Then there was Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Ancient sources, colored by political hatred, accused her of insatiable lust and conspiracies. Whether true or slander, her downfall was a spectacle. Stripped of her titles, she fled barefoot through Rome's gardens, her royal body trembling. Guards seized her, and she was executed swiftly, her death a public lesson in obedience. These imperial punishments revealed a terrifying truth. Even empresses, draped in purple and crowned with jewels, were not safe. If they could be stripped, humiliated, and killed, what hope was there for ordinary wives? Beneath the famous names, Octavia, Messalina, Julia, lie countless wives whose stories were never recorded. These were the silent victims, girls married at 13, handed like possessions to older men, trapped in homes where a husband's word was law. For them, disobedience could mean punishment not just from the state, but from the man who shared their bed. A husband could lock his wife in a cellar, shave her head, or force her into humiliating acts, claiming it was justice. Slaves were often ordered to watch or participate, turning private abuse into a grotesque performance. Imagine the fear of a girl barely out of childhood, accused not of treason, but of being too outspoken, too defiant, too unwilling to submit. Her punishment could be exiled to a barren rock like Pandateria, where the salty wind cut like knives and food was scarce. More often, it was humiliation within her own household, unseen, unrecorded, but no less scarring. Some victims fought back in silence. Ancient writers mention wives who took their own lives rather than face the degradation awaiting them. Suicide became their final rebellion. If Rome demanded their bodies a spectacle, they would deny the empire its theater. Others endured, living as shadows of themselves, broken yet alive, their names erased from history, but their suffering echoing across centuries. The cruelty of Rome's punishments lay not only in their brutality, but in their erasure. These women were not remembered as individuals. They became examples, warnings, symbols. Their suffering was anonymized, absorbed into the empire's hunger for order. Their voices, silenced then, survive only as whispers in dusty texts, faint echoes of lives lived in fear. Yet their silence is haunting. Beneath the triumphal arches and marble forums, you can almost hear them, the weeping of wives punished for defiance, the cries of girls forced into degradation, the silence of those exiled to windswept rocks where waves mourn them in place of the world. Rome's punishments escalated from law to humiliation, from humiliation to sexualized torture, from torture to imperial spectacles of cruelty. At every stage, the message was clear: obedience was demanded, disobedience was annihilated. But in pushing so far, the empire revealed its own fragility. The very punishments meant to preserve order bred hatred, whispers, and despair. Nowhere is this clearer than in the downfall of women like Octavia and Messalina, names etched into history not for their lives, but for the brutal manner of their destruction. Octavia, the first wife of Emperor Nero, stood as the image of Roman virtue, dutiful, chaste, adored by the people for her quiet dignity. But virtue meant little in a palace ruled by paranoia. Nero, consumed by lust for his mistress Poppaea Sabina, sought to rid himself of Octavia. The accusation was the same as countless others before her: adultery. It mattered little that she was innocent. Guilt was merely an excuse for punishment. Dragged from the palace, Octavia was paraded through the streets, her garments torn, her hair hacked away. The people wept as they watched her stripped of her imperial dignity. She was sent into exile on Pandateria, the same barren rock where Augustus had banished his own daughter years earlier. There, surrounded by salt air and crashing waves, Octavia wept alone. Days later, executioners came. Ancient sources describe her final hours with chilling brevity. Her veins were opened, her young body left to bleed in silence. Rome's most virtuous empress, reduced to nothing. Her only crime: disobedience in the face of a husband's desire. Then there was Messalina, the infamous wife of Emperor Claudius. Ancient historians, colored by political hatred, accused her of insatiable lust, of nightly escapades through Rome's brothels, of conspiracies against her husband. Whether true or slanderous propaganda crafted by enemies, one fact remains: her fall was staged as a grotesque theater. When her supposed crimes were revealed, Messalina fled barefoot through the gardens of Rome, her once regal body trembling in fear. Guards seized her, dragged her to the side of the road, and forced her to wait for Claudius's judgment. But judgment never came. Instead, soldiers executed her swiftly, cutting her down as she wept. Some accounts say she begged for mercy, others that she died in stunned silence. What mattered was not truth, but the performance of punishment, an empress reduced to an object lesson. Obedience ignored, disobedience destroyed. These were not isolated tragedies, they were part of a pattern. Noble women like Julia, the daughter of Augustus, also met their end in exile, accused of sexual disobedience, and left to rot on desolate islands until starvation claimed them. The empire's message was brutal in its simplicity. Even the daughters and wives of emperors could not escape the machinery of control. Yet in these climactic punishments, irony dripped like blood from a wound. While Rome sought to preserve its honor through the humiliation of wives, it only exposed its hypocrisy. Nero, who condemned Octavia for adultery, indulged in incest and murder. Claudius, who executed Messalina, remarried swiftly as though she had never existed. Augustus, who banished his daughter for sexual immorality, filled his palace with mistresses. The punishments meant to uphold morality instead revealed the empire's sickness. Rome was not protecting honor, it was weaponizing shame. The wives became mirrors, reflecting the insecurity of men who ruled not with stability, but with fear. In their downfalls, the empire itself began to crack. Octavia's death sparked murmurs of discontent among the people. Messalina's execution filled the Senate with unease. Every wife punished so publicly became a ghost haunting the marble halls, a reminder that no family was safe, no marriage sacred, no woman beyond the reach of cruelty. The climax of Rome's punishments was not just the death of individual women, it was the death of trust between husbands and wives, between rulers and ruled, between Rome's proud ideals and its rotten reality. As the empire faltered under the weight of corruption, decadence, and paranoia, the shadow of these tragedies lingered beneath the ruins. Rome did not fall only to foreign armies. It fell to the sickness within, the obsession with control, the paranoia of power, the cruelty dressed as morality. Nothing reveals that inner rot more clearly than the blood of wives sacrificed upon the altar of obedience. When we gaze at the ruins of Rome today, the marble columns, the triumphal arches, the grand amphitheaters, we are told to see glory. But hidden in those stones are the cries of wives punished not for crimes of treason, but for the crime of disobedience. Their lives remind us that the greatest empires often carry rot at their core. The sexual punishments inflicted on Rome's wives were not merely justice, they were propaganda, turning women into symbols, tools in the empire's endless obsession with control. In doing so, Rome betrayed its own ideals of virtue and honor. It revealed itself as an empire terrified of defiance, so fragile that the whisper of a wife's voice could send men rushing to violence. Their stories echo across time. From medieval chastity belts to Victorian asylums, the control of women's bodies remained a weapon of power. But to remember Rome's silent victims is to resist their erasure. To recognize that behind every law and spectacle was a human life trembling in fear, stripped of dignity. History asks us to remember them not as warnings, but as individuals, girls, wives, mothers, whose voices were silenced but whose suffering still speaks. Their stories challenge us to question the systems that demand obedience at the cost of humanity, to confront the hypocrisy that cloaks cruelty in the guise of justice, and to honor the resilience of those who endured in the face of unimaginable shame. As we close this journey, let's carry their echoes forward. If this story has stirred something in you, if it's made you question, feel, or wonder, don't let it end here. Subscribe to keep exploring the hidden corners of history with us. Like this video to show the world these stories matter. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And comment below with your thoughts, your reflections, or just where you're watching from. Together, we can build a community that refuses to let the past stay silent, that finds strength in uncovering the truths others tried to bury. Because by remembering Rome's forgotten wives, we not only honor their lives, we reclaim the humanity Rome tried to erase. Let's keep their stories alive, And in doing so, let's remind ourselves that even in the shadow of empire, the human spirit endures.